So this is chapter 24, and this is actually a pretty fun chapter. This is about how species came to be and how evolution happens. So we're going to start out by talking about macroevolution, and we've already touched on microevolution, which is looking at changes from one generation to the next. And macroevolution is looking at over a huge period of time, seeing species evolve. So obviously this is going to take a long period of time to happen. This isn't going to happen in 30 years or something like that, generally. So remember, evolution is change and it's modification of structures in the past. And we are going to use the word species a lot, and we've touched on this a little bit too. And remember, the biological concept of a species, and this was actually technically defined in 1942, is a species is going to be a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. So viable means that they're actually alive, and fertile means that they could reproduce and pass those genes on themselves. So anything that cannot do that is not going to be part of the population. For example, the liger, right? So the liger is definitely going to be where they've gotten a lion and a tiger together and they got them to mate, but those are usually sterile or something happens to them that prevents that. And I am going to zoom this in so you can actually see this better. Okay, so that's going to be what a species is. Now, there can be geographic variation within a species, and a lot of times that might mean that a species is on its way to becoming separate species. So if you look at this picture here, these snakes that you can actually see, these are all the same species, but what's happening is they're found in different parts of the US, so most likely these are going to eventually turn into separate species just because they're having different environmental challenges that are being brought to them and stuff like that. So technically right now all of these could interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring, but in the future, there could be a point where they will not be able to exchange information. And of course, I was actually reading up on this, and they were saying that they're already seeing a couple times where they are not mating successfully. So that could be a sign that they're becoming their own separate species, which is kind of cool. Okay. So when that happens, you're going to call that a subspecies, and we'll get into that in a later chapter about how we actually write the species name and those types of things. So this next part's pretty fun, and this part is talking about how species are going to maintain their genetic distinctiveness. So what that means is why an ant and an elephant are not going to mate with one another. So there's a couple of reasons why that would happen, and think about it, they're separate species, right? So there's two types that can happen. You can have prezygotic barriers, which are obviously going to happen before fertilization. So those are going to be things that will keep two species from even trying to fertilize. And then on the end of that is postzygotic barriers, and those are going to be barriers that happen after the zygote has formed. So all of the things are right, a zygote comes together, but then something happens. So we're going to start with prezygotic barriers. And so the first type is going to be what's called ecological isolation. And all that means is that, I mean, an ant and an, no, okay, let's say, let's use my example that I have in your PowerPoint here. Okay. We're going to skip through this one real fast. Okay, so here's a great example of ecological isolation. So what that means is you've got a snake living in the water, and then you've got a snake living in the tree, and they're two separate species, and the chances of them even coming together to try to mate are pretty slim because one lives in the water and one lives in the tree, right? So that's ecological isolation. They're living in different habitats. Now, this next one is probably the most common one, and that's behavioral isolation. And so that's just a case of mixed signals. So let's say that I'm walking down the street with my friends, and I decide that it's ladies' night. We're going to find some mates for the night. And so we're walking along, and all of a sudden I see this that is on your screen show up. That's beautiful, but it's not like I'm going to be like, oh, that's sexy, I think I'm going to go home with that, right? That's kind of strange. So that is actually a mating procedure that this bird is doing here. It's actually doing a little dance, and it's ruffling its feathers. This is a bird of paradise. If you ever YouTube these guys, they're super cool. But anyway, it is cool, but it's not sending a mating message to me, right? So it's a mixed signals kind of thing. So that's going to be the most common one. Birds chirping, they may have different songs. Another one that's included in this are pheromones. So pheromones are chemicals that are released that one organism might be very attracted to, and the other one will be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So that's going to probably be the biggest barrier to keeping species as different entities. Okay, another hilarious one is mechanical isolation. So if we go back to that example of the ant and the elephant, sometimes even if all the signals are correct, if the parts don't fit together physically, then they're not going to be able to fertilize one another. So that's a case of mechanical isolation. Even if this ant is in love with this elephant, they're probably not going to be able to actually perform the act, right? So that's mechanical isolation. So those are going to be pre-zygotic barriers, and here they all are listed right here. Now, one I don't have a picture for is what's called gametic isolation. And gametic isolation is going to be where you have the two gametes, so fertilization is about to occur, but then when they come together, usually due to like chromosome number or something, it all just falls apart. So you don't actually form a zygote. Sperm and egg do not fuse together. So those are all pre-zygotic barriers. This next part is going to be post-zygotic barriers. So these are going to be things where the sperm and the egg do come together, but then something happens to it. So there's a couple of forms of it. There's three. First one is reduced hybrid viability. So hybrid is talking about when you have two species coming together, and viability is talking about if something is able to live. So reduced hybrid viability means that that zygote dies. So it starts to divide and then something goes wrong and all of those cells just kind of fall apart. The next one, reduced hybrid fertility, so fertility is talking about whether they can have offspring or not, they're going to have sterile offspring. So that is what happens with the horse and the donkey and the mule idea. Now, the last one, hybrid breakdown, actually did happen with the whole horse, donkey, mule thing a couple of years ago. There was a farmer who called in and was like, I thought these guys were supposed to be sterile once we mated the two species. And what actually happened is hybrid breakdown. So that first generation that was produced was fine and actually could produce fertile offspring. What were fertile, but then that next generation, the offspring were sterile. So it's kind of just a little bit further down the line. So that's hybrid breakdown. So one thing I want to bring up in this next part about alternative concepts of species is that we often think of a species with that definition that I gave. I guarantee you there are cases out there where species did not follow these rules. So there's always going to be exceptions to these rules in nature. It always finds a way around this stuff. So keep that in mind. And please remember that, because there's always going to be crazy things people are doing in labs. And so what we try to do is just kind of learn the rules of nature as well as we can. And obviously there will be exceptions. Okay, so on the next video we're going to go into how speciation actually occurs.